Charles Lindbergh tragically lost his son to a kidnapping. But when it came to his children, the public had no idea Charles led a shocking double life. He took his darker secret to the grave, but it wasn't long before the disturbing truth came out. We'll get more into that story later on. From an early age, Charles had an interest in the mechanics of motorized transportation, including his family's Saxon 6 automobile and later his Excelsior motorbike. By the time that he started college as a mechanical engineering student, he had also become fascinated with flying, though he had never been close enough to a plane to touch it. After quitting college in February of 1922, Lindbergh enrolled at the Nebraska Aircraft Corporation's flying school in Lincoln and flew for the first time. At that point, he had no idea that he would become one of the most famous aviators in history. In response to the first non-stop transatlantic flight in 1919, wealthy hotelier Raymond Ortegue partnered with the Aero Club of America for a historic contest. Whoever could fly non-stop from New York City to Paris first would receive $25,000, providing it was within 5 years. Since no one achieved this initially, the contest extended in 1924 to another 5 years. This was when Charles became interested. Having been flying as an airmail pilot since October of 1925, he believed this competition would be a piece of cake compared to his usual job in winter. But as we now know, it was not all smooth sailing. As he prepared for his flight on the morning of May 20th, 1927, it likely felt like the weather was against him, as the rain didn't seem to let up. With the runway so wet and muddy, workers had to wheel the plane into position, at which point the clouds broke and the downpour finally stopped. Although the clouds were parting, Charles still had to deal with another kind of fog. By the time he launched this endeavor, several pilots had made previously unsuccessful attempts, many of which either perished, became injured, or just disappeared. Needless to say, preparation was everything, including getting a good night's sleep. But all this work had made Charles so busy that he barely slept the night before. Still, he wasn't about to postpone, especially with such a crowd. On the morning of his takeoff, a crowd of several thousand people gathered to see him depart. Finally, it was time. Having taken off at 7:52 a.m., Charles reached Boston 2 hours later and noted Cape Cod to his right, but was already experiencing issues. Nothing was wrong with the plane, but as the adrenaline of starting his flight wore off, his body remembered his lack of sleep. Over the first day, Charles flew along the coast and found it challenging to stave off that desire to sleep, often changing altitude to keep things interesting. But it wasn't long before he got another rush of adrenaline. At around 8 p.m. the stars had come out, but Charles still had trouble seeing where he was going, as a thick fog had descended. From his altitude of 800 feet, he climbed above the fog to 7,500 feet, and eventually 10,000 feet. There he found an enormous thunderhead, and with little cause, flew straight into it, only to turn around when ice started to form. Unfortunately, his energy level wasn't improving. Halfway through his trip, his lack of sleep was proving more and more of a burden, especially as he passed his 18th hour. Falling asleep for seconds, possibly minutes at a time, he started to hallucinate due to his exhaustion. He was planning to celebrate reaching this point in the journey, but his mental state made this impossible. Luckily, he made it across. Having passed 27 hours of flight, Charles thankfully started to see fishing boats, which led him to believe that he had officially crossed the Atlantic. Finally, he passed over his first bit of European land in Dingle Bay, Ireland, around 2.5 hours ahead of schedule. After 33.5 hours of flying, Charles finally reached Paris on May 21st, intending to land. But before he did, he wanted to please his spectators and circle the Eiffel Tower. He did so, and then finally touched down on the field at 10:22 p.m., with a crowd of over 100,000 cheering fans in attendance. After his flight, this excitement followed him everywhere. Having accomplished such an astonishing feat, Charles's reputation grew, and soon everyone in the world wanted to meet him. Over the next few years, he received many requests to visit other countries and influential people, as well as proposals for endorsement deals and marriages. Shortly after his flight, Charles traveled to Mexico on a goodwill tour, invited by the U.S. ambassador and his financial advisor, Dwight Morrow. While he was there, he met Morrow's daughter Anne, and the two of them clicked right away. After 2 years of dating, they married on May 27th in 1929, and it wouldn't be just the two of them for long. The following year, Charles and Anne's household grew as they welcomed their first child and son, Charles Augustus Lindbergh, Jr. Over the next decade and a half, Anne would give birth to 6 more children, the last being Reeve Lindbergh in 1945. With all his business and publicity, though, their children only got to see their father a few months in a year. Sadly, something sinister was on the horizon. On the evening of March 1st, 1932, fate dealt the Lindberghs a real-life nightmare. Their nurse, Betty Gow, realized the 20-month-old firstborn Charles was nowhere to be found. Betty immediately shared this disturbing news with Charles, who went to investigate. When he searched his son's room, he made a chilling discovery. A ransom note sat waiting on the windowsill, and there was something strange about it. The grammar was spectacularly bad, and the handwriting itself was abysmal. Part of it read, "Dear Sir, have 50,000 ready, 25,000 in $20 bills, 15,000 in $10 bills, and 10,000 in $5 bills. After 2 to 4 days, we will inform you where to deliver the money." The note also warned the Lindberghs not to involve the authorities. Charles's reaction was heartbreaking. The disappearance of his child caused him to reach for his firearm. Both he and the butler went out to search the grounds, but what they discovered outside the baby's window likely made their blood run cold. Someone had clearly used a ladder to climb into the residence and take the baby. They found the remnants of a ladder, as well as a baby's blanket. What was Charles Lindbergh to do? Well, first off, he chose not to abide by the ransom note's request, hastily getting into contact with the authorities and his attorney. An investigation was launched immediately, but the findings were utterly disappointing. Though a fingerprint expert scoured the room, the ladder, and the note, they came up with nothing. It also didn't help that the distressing news spread like wildfire. As a celebrity, Charles Lindbergh's name drew a lot of attention, and so when the news of his missing child leaked, curious onlookers and folks hoping to help arrived at the Lindbergh residence. Unfortunately, they wound up doing a lot more harm than good, likely destroying any evidence of footprints that there had been. Even during the trying times of the Great Depression, Charles Lindbergh and his wife were willing to go to jaw-dropping lengths to have their son returned to them. On top of the $25,000 reward offered by New Jersey officials, the Lindberghs sweetened the pot by promising another $50,000, bringing the total reward money to $75,000, which, as you could imagine, was a lot of money back in the day. Charles had a powerful hand in the investigation, but there were more twists in store for him. The first ransom note certainly wasn't the last, and several others were sent with updated conditions, one being that the ransom amount had been woefully raised. $70,000 was the hefty price for the safe return of little Charles. In the end, the Lindberghs decided to pay this ransom in part. Through the intermediary, John Condon, a retired teacher, the ransom was eventually offered up to the kidnappers, who agreed to accept just $50,000. But though they promised that the child was still alive, the truth was utterly devastating. On May 12th, Charles's worst fears were made real. His son was found, but he was not alive. A delivery truck driver found the boy's remains by happenstance by the side of the road. It looked like the perpetrators had attempted to bury him, but they had done a horrible job of it. After all that, Charles chose to cremate his little boy, but even plagued by the sting of grief and defeat, there was still justice to be had. For 2 years, the kidnapping investigation dragged on until finally something popped up. Authorities had recorded the serial numbers of the bills used in the ransom, one of which surfaced when German immigrant Richard Hauptmann paid for gasoline in 1934. After authorities found evidence in his home, including $13,670 of the ransom, he was eventually sentenced and executed on April 3, 1936. This was a small amount of justice for the horrors inflicted on the Lindbergh family. In the years following the incident, Charles's work continually took him away from home. Stemming from his prolific reputation and status as a colonel in the Army Reserves, the U.S. approached Charles with a request in 1936. Over several visits, he traveled to Berlin to meet officials and attend social functions, with the primary objective being to assess their air force in the years leading up to World War II. As it happened, he might have been the wrong choice. Charles had made some powerful connections with the German government, later attending a dinner with several officials in 1938. While there, the German air chief even gave him the Command Cross of the Order of the German Eagle. After examining the steadily growing German Air Force and thinking back to the brutality of World War I, Charles's view on America's part in these global affairs formed. Knowing that a large-scale conflict was coming, he adamantly opposed the U.S.'s involvement. This kind of thinking, though, didn't last long. His views on appeasement and isolation seemed to vanish following Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor. Suddenly, he wanted to join America's fight in World War II, meeting with the U.S. government to request his re-enlistment in the Army Air Forces. But to his surprise, the door was slammed shut in his face, and nothing could have prepared him for their cold response. Unsurprisingly, most people who heard Charles's request to join up again as a U.S. Army pilot were pretty hesitant, to say the least, given his long history of public statements ranging from promoting appeasement to sympathizing with Germany. The Army didn't trust him. Roosevelt simply stated, "You can't have an officer leading men who thinks we're licked before we start." Of course, Charles didn't take no for an answer. Having been denied a recommission, he looked for other ways to do his part, including working with Henry Ford as a technical advisor. He then got much closer to the action in 1944. One United Aircraft sent him as a representative to the Pacific as a means to study aircraft in combat. But he did much more than any typical civilian. To all appearances, Charles considered his job with United Aircraft the same as being in the Army. He even bought a naval uniform without an insignia before leaving. And this went further during his time there, as the Army allowed him to fly 50 combat missions while still acting as a civilian. Charles's career had certainly been a roller coaster. As the years wore on and he grew older, his lasting legacy seemed already set in stone. But it would later prove to be far more malleable than he realized. After constructing an A-frame cottage in 1971, he chose the Hawaiian destination as his place of retirement. Unfortunately, things took a turn for the worse. A year after building his retirement home, Charles received a grave piece of news. Diagnosed with cancer, he spent the next 2 years exploring different solutions, including radiation treatments in Maui, and traveling to New York to stay at the Columbia Presbyterian Medical Center. At a certain point, though, he knew where he wanted to be. After staying at the New York hospital for 26 days in 1974, Charles and his doctors saw no improvement in his condition. Knowing this was the end, he and his wife returned to Hawaii that summer to be at home. 1 week after returning on August 26, 1974, Charles passed due to lymphoma. In the end, his legacy was marred by controversy. Even in death, there was more to his story. You see, Charles had taken his darkest secret to his grave. To fully understand it, we have to flash back to the start of 1957. At this time, he was indeed married to Anne, but quite scandalously, he was in no way faithful to her. He cheated on her with 3 different women. Not only that, but these were so much more than brief flings. These affairs were quite long, their length proved by the fact that he fathered multiple children with each of his mistresses. With Bridget Hessemer, a hatmaker from Germany, he had 3 children. Keeping things in the family, he also pursued a romantic relationship with Bridget's sister, Mariette, who was a painter. With her, he had 2 children as well. And somehow, he didn't stop there. On top of the 2 German sisters, Charles also became involved with his European private secretary, Valeska. He had 2 children with her too, born in 1959 and 1961. All in all, Charles had fathered 7 children with his mistresses in less than a decade. But he also didn't want the world to discover this truth. If there was one secret he wanted to take to his grave, this was it. And knowing that the Grim Reaper was on his doorstep, he did something quite desperate. 10 days before he passed away, he wrote a letter to all 3 of his secret lovers, asking them to keep their lips sealed about everything, the affairs and the children. All 3 women were loyal to his wishes, so much so that even the children had no clue who their real father actually was. On the rare occasions that Charles visited his illegitimate children, he did so under a fake name. To them, he was simply Kuru Kent, and definitely not one of the most famous aviators in history. Quite possibly, Charles may have gotten away with burying his scandalous secrets forever if it hadn't been for one of his daughters. When Astrid found 150 love letters, she had physical proof of her suspicions. There were also photographs. Still, she kept his secret until her mother and Anne Lindbergh passed on. Then she and her siblings felt free to make the truth known. His children were, as you'd expect, devastated to find out their father had secret families. But that just proved that no secret can truly stay buried forever. If you enjoyed this Factornate video, give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more incredible stories. Want to say in who we cover next? Join our membership program through the link in the description for exclusive perks. Your support means everything to us. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.